which has been popular in academia, that Chinese government derives performance legitimacy, meaning that it earns the support of the population from delivering strong economic growth. The fact is that Chinese Communist Party has been in power both in good economic times and in bad economic times. So they are not exposed politically to economic pains, recession, high level of unemployment. Look at the 2008 financial crisis and then Trump trade war during his first administration, and then the COVID lockdown, which really devastated the Chinese economy. Do you see any weakening of the Chinese Communist Party? I don't see any tangible evidence that its ability to rule has been weakened by these experiences.
So in other words, the economic slowdown is no threat to the government's stability in that sense?
Especially in the short run. And I can even go further. This type of economic slowdown that is instigated by America can actually help them politically. The simple fact is that before the recent trade war, Chinese economy was trending down and struggling. And the view among business elites is that the COVID lockdown and crackdown on the private sector were responsible for that slowdown. The trade war by Trump administration has diverted attention away from the Chinese policy decisions that have really been responsible for the economic struggles.
Do you mean these decisions like cracking down on the real estate sector and on private enterprise a few years back?
You have to restructure the real estate sector. But the point is that you know that the real estate sector is a big part of the Chinese economy. By some estimate, it's almost 30% of the Chinese economy. When you are restructuring 30% of your economy, you really need other sectors of the economy to perform and to grow. The problem is that with the left hand, you went after the real estate sector. With the right hand, you went after the private sector. It's just not a very wise combination. And the COVID lockdown, which really undermined the consumer confidence, investor confidence. So there was plenty of the blame going around with the policy decisions that the Chinese government made. And now Trump tariff is a political gift. They just say, oh, it's America that has been responsible for the economic problems in our country.
And we're certainly seeing quite a lot in the Chinese media that suggests the government is trying to sort of rally people to all stand together, and it creates a sense of a patriotic spirit.
Yeah, when you invoke nationalism, you lose all the kind of analytical and fact-based perspective. And so this is exactly the right key to play on. And so arguably, it is strengthening the political hand of the Chinese Communist Party because of this diversion of attention. So the political resilience is at least because of two things. One is that there's not this very close connections between economics and politics. And that's just the nature of the autocratic regime, unlike in a democracy. And the other is that this trade war has strengthened the political hand of the Chinese Communist Party. I would argue on the economic side, China is exposed to global economy, to global markets, and to the trade shocks. China had a very large trade surplus last year, reaching a record of almost $1 trillion. It has a large trade surplus with the United States. It already has a very substantial overcapacity that has to go somewhere because the domestic economy is not absorbing that capacity. So it's just the sheer economic numbers suggest that the country is exposed. And that's why Goldman Sachs and other companies have downgraded their GDP forecast of China. I think before they were forecasting along the same line as the Chinese government, 5%, something like that, but now it's like 4%. And some are forecasting a unemployment increase anywhere between 15 million and 20 million people, just a little bit smaller than the 2008 impact on Chinese economy. So
from the global financial crisis that year.
Global financial crisis that year. So on the economic side, there's no question that Chinese economy is actually quite vulnerable to the trade shocks.
Some economists have argued that actually, as a percentage of China's GDP, exports are relatively small, and that therefore it won't hit China as badly as some people think. But you don't agree with that?
That's the wrong way to look at it. It's not like 100% wrong, but it's 50% wrong. They are looking at the trade share of the GDP in isolation. So it is true that if you look at trade share of GDP, China is about like 37, US is 27, but there are many, many other countries that have much higher trade share to GDP. India is much higher, Japan is much higher, South Korea is much higher. So these economists draw the conclusion that China is not that exposed. The problem with that view is that they don't look at other economic indicators, and all the countries I named and the countries I'm going to name, like Germany, Vietnam, they all have much higher shares of domestic private consumption relative to GDP as compared with China. Okay, so how do you get lower trade share of the GDP for China compared with these countries and lower consumption shares of the GDP? The reason is that you got to have high investment shares of the GDP.
Investment into sort of infrastructure and hardware.
All these investments in infrastructure. So now you decrease the trade shares of the GDP, and then you want to keep growing. You want to keep the GDP growth at the same level as before. Now what do? You either have to increase the private consumption, which is going to take time, which requires fundamental reforms of the system. Even if the Chinese Communist Party wants to do that, the result of those reforms is not going to deliver GDP growth immediately, right? Then the other option is to raise the investment share, and you are already the world champion of that. So there's probably not much that you can go and raise, or you raise it at the cost of other things, such as debt to GDP ratio. And by the way, China has one of the highest debt to GDP ratios in the world. And the other cost that you have to pay for is in the form of lower productivity, lower efficiency.
And presumably, from your point of view, what you're saying is that the idea that the government or that sort of state actors can invest lots of money to kind of boost the economy as they did really in 2008 at the time of the financial crisis, is not viable now. And of course, we're now in a global context where China is already criticized a lot for subsidizing a lot of its industry, that's led to overcapacity and cheaper goods arriving in the rest of the world. So presumably it would be very difficult, even if they could afford it.
There are two kinds of viabilities. There's a mechanical viability. They can still invest. They can still build bridges. You can build 3 other airports in Beijing. They can do that. But this is extremely costly to the Chinese economy because you have to raise the debt to GDP ratio to do this, and you degrade productivity and capital efficiency.
But it does seem that at this point, the government isn't really planning to do that. We haven't seen that kind of huge stimulus that we saw in 2008.
We see some indication. They don't go as high as 2008, but I don't think they have given up on doing some version of 2008. They are already at the very high investment share of the GDP, so they should be careful about raising it further. But with the Trump trade war, they may change the tune, right? They may do a smaller version of that. Even a smaller version of that, it is still quite a big policy direction that they move to, given how high the debt is relative to GDP. In 2008, the debt to GDP was about 120%. Now it is 290%. So even if you don't do the full scale of 2008, you do a third of it, you do a 1/4 of it. At that high debt to GDP ratio, that is a big, big impact. And the other thing I want to say is that this is like a solution that solves a very short-term problem, which is the GDP growth rate, but planting the seeds for long-term problems. So essentially, over-investment today is overcapacity tomorrow if you don't solve the private consumption problem.
So in a way, are you suggesting that perhaps over the next few months, if the tariffs and the trade war really start to bring higher unemployment, for example, in China, that we might actually see the government doing more in terms of spending on infrastructure and other types of investment like that?
They may not be doing an exact version of 2008. This time, the narrative is science and technology. They have been doing that, by the way, already, right? Building the data centers and building the EV factories. And now with the success of the DeepSeek, there will be millions of companies receiving bank loans and government money to build their large language models, to build the algorithms. I mean, when you invest in science and technology, it is not as capital intensive as building infrastructure. So the amount of the capital they put in is probably not on the same scale, but it is just another version of it.
You think that would produce a lot of waste or at least a lot
absolutely.
of overlapping capacity?
Yeah, there's no question about it. The past investments were in the EVs. There are like between 200 and 400 EV producers in China in lots of different regions. And there are a lot of the data centers being built that don't have any usage. It's already happening. So they may or may not go back to the 2008 version, but the same rationale, same justification. You build EVs, you build data center, you build all these things to raise the productivity, what they call the new force productivity economy. But when you have overcapacity, by definition, you're not raising productivity. You're actually degrading productivity. So I think recent indications do suggest that they may be doing a little bit more on the consumption side. But I just think relative to the supply side, the consumption side actions are not nearly as consequential.
Well, I know that goes back very much to the points you've made in several of your books, and you wrote the book Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics, which came out around the financial crisis year 2008, and I believe that you're soon to publish the revised version, which is called Statism with Chinese Characteristics.
Yeah.
From directional liberalism to China model. And I know that you have talked a lot and researched a lot on this question of household income and how that rose very fast during the 1980s in the early years of China's reforms. But you see the model as having changed very much over the past 20 years, where things now are much more top down. There's much more of a focus on big government rather than sort of letting the economy just develop in its own way as it did in those early reform years. How significant a problem do you see that as being now? And do you think there's any sign or any way that the government can tackle this?
So in 2008, I published the book just on the eve of financial crisis. And I ended my book on an optimistic note. In the concluding chapter, I expressed my wish and hope that Hu Jintao was going to address the demand side issues in the Chinese economy and using at that time, a full-blown financial crisis had not yet happened, but there were plenty of signs that the financial crisis was coming. So I said that the government should use this opportunity to address the demand side issues and to pay more attention to rural China, to financial reforms. And by the way, between 2002 and 2007, before the financial crisis, the Hu Jintao leadership was kind of moving in that direction. It wasn't like a big move as compared with 1980s. So the demand side issues are basically about raising the personal income of the Chinese people, providing social protection, basic education, and also promoting employment, including labor-intensive employment, not just technology and science and capital-intensive employment. And a little bit down the road is reforms of the land system and the hukou system, right? Which the current system doesn't give the rural Chinese the same entitlements as the urban Chinese.
That's the household registration system, which entitles you to welfare, for example, if you work in the city. But if you're a migrant worker, you still don't qualify in the same way.
And I made the argument back then for a wholesale reforms of that system. They practically didn't do any of that. Instead, they pivoted to a investment supply side program that saved the Chinese GDP, but planted all these problems that we have been talking about: overcapacity, excess debt, lower productivity growth, lack of domestic private consumption. And by the way, going back to your comment about Western economists, their program was widely praised by Western economists. And I just thought that was just shameful because they don't know what they are talking about.
But some of the overcapacity that you talk about coming as a result of that is now widely criticized by most people in the West.
And sometimes by the same people who praised their program in 2008, they didn't quite understand. The infrastructure programs didn't lead to the long run boost of the personal income of the Chinese people. It led to a short-term boost because you need to hire construction workers and all of that. But in the long run, it didn't really broaden employment. So what is really important about the overcapacity is the underconsumption. When you don't have high income growth, you don't have a lot of money to consume. I think that's very straightforward logic. So let me just give you some simple data point. China is the second largest GDP in the world. It accounts for about 13% of the global consumption, 13. But 30% of the manufacturing capacity. So you're consuming 13% as compared with 18% of the global population share, and you're consuming 13% relative to 30% of the production capacity. That is a very striking definition of overcapacity. And the other thing is that if you look at other countries, how they deal with financial crisis, economic crisis, recessions, it is always a combination of stimulus program with reforms. 2008 was all about stimulus, none about reforms. So in the concluding chapter of my 2008 book, I was expressing the hope that they will focus on rural reforms, hukou system reforms, educational reforms, and things like that. None of that happened. There were some small-scale hukou reforms in one region or the other, but really nothing substantial.
So overall, people from rural regions still don't have the right to move as they wish to any city and enjoy the welfare that the local residents get.
there were some really small reforms here and there, but not really fundamental reforms.
Often in some smaller cities, right?
Yeah, and smaller cities that were overbuilt in the first place. So it's like moving people to ghost cities. Those reforms were designed to solve an economic problem, which is overcapacity in housing assets, rather than a move to raise the social protection of the rural Chinese, which should be the goal of such reforms.
In the intervening time, which you cover in the new version of your book, obviously there's been a change of leadership. Xi Jinping became the top leader in 2012-13. Do you see any sense under this current leadership that the type of reforms that you wanted to see in China could still be possible?
I think to be objective about the period since 2012, the Xi Jinping era, when he came into power, he did put in policy programs, not reform programs, but policy programs that were designed to raise the income of the rural population, to also solve some specific problems in the Chinese society, such as environmental degradation, air pollution, and the food safety. And also he emphasized the common prosperity. So they did make income transfers. So it is not right on the part of some Western analysts to say that he didn't like social welfare, he didn't make income transfers. He did. And the rural income growth did pick up, but mostly because of the income transfers rather than because of the reforms. And that's a critical distinction.
Were they mainly short-term sort of subsidies or extra cash payments to people to stay in these rural areas?
Yeah, cash payments, poverty relief, they did quite a bit of that. And it did raise the growth rate of the rural population, not as much, nearly as close as what happened in the 1980s. But that helped, right? So that did help. And also another thing that is positive is that the domestic private consumption share of the GDP did rise under Xi Jinping.
Did it rise enough from your point of view?
Not enough. So that's the key point. In order to do enough of that, it requires really fundamental reforms, fiscal reforms, financial reforms, and maximizing employment promotion rather than simply relying on income transfer. The private consumption share of the GDP did increase, but we're talking about increasing from really extremely low level to still quite low level by international standard. Today is about 39%. And India is 60%, US is almost 70%, South Korea 55%. No major economies have lower than 50% of the private consumption to GDP. So 39%, that got stuck there.
I mean, some people have argued that there's this sort of tradition in Chinese culture that people like to save, but you don't see that as the real reason.
Well, then by that logic, they're ruling out the Taiwanese as a traditional Chinese culture.
Because Taiwan has a much higher ratio.
Much higher. Japan, these are all East Asian cultures. None of the East Asian societies ever has this low level of private consumption GDP ratio. And China, of all the East Asian economies, China shouldn't have a low level because it's a huge economy, it's huge population. You can be more self-sufficient. You actually don't need to rely on foreign markets who absorb your production. And the fact is, in the 1980s, China had a normal East Asian level of private consumption GDP share. It was about 50%.
Does this go back to the point you make, I mean, even in your new book title, about the question of the China model? And I believe that you have focused a lot on how during that early reform era, there was much more access to private finance for people in rural areas, and that was very much stopped sort of after the 1990s, and that the focus has been much more on investment in things like technology and science, but not things that are affecting the grassroots so much. Is that what you see as one of the key problems?
Yeah, basically, if there are two words that can describe both the success of China and its current challenges, it is rural economy. People don't associate the word rural with China anymore. They look at Shanghai and Beijing skyscrapers, high-speed rail. Under the hukou system, China still has between 600 million and 700 million rural Chinese.
So they're registered as rural residents, not
as
urban.
Yeah. And people focus on the other data, which is that there are a lot of rural migrant workers, something like 300 million rural migrant workers. But the point is that the 700 million rural Chinese under the hukou system have much lower level of entitlements as compared with the urban Chinese.
In terms of welfare benefits and so on.
Local school, local hospitals, and across the board. So the fact that you are 300 million rural migrant worker, you may live in the city, but you still have a lower level of social welfare. From an economic perspective, what matters from an overcapacity point of view, what matters is how much of the income that you derive, how much of the social protection you have access to, because those factors affect your consumption pattern. None of the past East Asian successful cases discriminated against their rural population. So in the forthcoming book, I have one section in the last chapter. The title is Why China is Not East Asia. And I reached the conclusion on the basis of that.
What kind of areas would be realistic in terms of generating greater income for rural people, in terms of what kind of work could be created or jobs could be created without just leading to more, manufacturing that creates more excess capacity?
I think I would think of two things. One is having to do with the urban administration. Urban administration. In many cities in China, actually in all of them, they have this government agency known as Urban Administration Bureau. Their one job is to stop the entrepreneurs who have not registered with the government, who are selling vegetables, who are selling clothes and things like that on the street.
On the street, yeah. So these are the people that are often, that are called in Chinese the chengguan, right? Who often are seen going around stopping people from doing their business on the street if they don't have the right permits.
They should just get rid of all of them overnight. Okay, so the Chinese cities are not going to look as pretty as they do now, but those entrepreneurial activities are a source of income to these mostly people who came from the rural areas, the small shops and peddling. These are the sources of their income, self-employment.
And you still think that there's more potential, more space for much more of that type of business to be carried out in China today?
The fact that they have a large, massive bureau to suppress that activity means that the potential for that activity is massive. So get rid of that immediately. The other is the land reforms. Privatize the land. Privatize the land. So that's another fundamental difference between China and the rest of East Asia. In China, the land is owned by the government, by the state, rather than by the rural residents.
Some farmers did, in theory, get a little bit of land, didn't they, during the reform period, even for a sort of number of decades?
And you get the use of the land. You don't get the ownership of the land. And there's a fundamental difference. Although there were active discussions in the 1980s about experimenting ownership reforms, that issue has basically come off the table ever since the 1980s. the rural Chinese got practically no benefit from industrialization and urbanization that used their land. If they had private ownership 20 years ago and 30 years ago, the wealth that was created probably is the same as the wealth that was actually created. But the distribution will be massively different. That wealth would have gone to millions and tens of millions and maybe even hundreds of millions of the rural Chinese, as opposed to going to a few land developers, real estate companies, and the government, plus the corrupt government officials.
But is it not too late for many of the Chinese rural population?
That's true. But on the other hand, I just think that better late than never, right? So I do believe that if they do that now, it will not have produced the same effect as doing it 30 years ago and 20 years ago. That's true. But on the other hand, if they were scattered development and urbanization programs, it could still have benefited some rural Chinese. But this is not something that the Chinese Communist Party would do easily. The way I think about the control pillars of the Chinese state, one is finance and the other is land. And it is not surprising that they are most reluctant to give up on these two pillars of the control. And my way of thinking about this is if you want to continue to grow at a sustainable rate to protect yourself against external trade shocks, you kind of have to move along on these two lines of the reforms.
So the finance should be easier for people to access as well.
The finance should be made more accessible to the private sector and less controlled by the government. I don't mind doing this over a period of time, gradually. That's totally okay. But you have to signal that you are moving in that direction. And this is where I don't really see a lot of evidence that the government is thinking like that.
You mentioned your 2023 book, The Rise and Fall of the East, which was an acronym for Exams, Autocracy, Stability, and Technology. And I know that you raised concerns about the direction in that book as well. But clearly, technology, as we mentioned earlier, is an area which the Chinese government is very focused on and, has seen some successes with in recent years, whether that's in the battery technology or now in AI with DeepSeek and all the other companies. Do you see that can become a significant and important driver as part of a balanced economy in China in the future? Or do you think that the risk is too great that there will be too much focus on these areas to the detriment of other sectors of the economy?
So at current Chinese per capita GDP, technology is a contributing force to the economy, but it is not a main contributing force. And other economies in the past, which achieved scientific and technological successes, didn't achieve economic success. Right? Soviet Union is an easy example. Soviet Union had remarkable scientific and in some areas technological advances, but look at where Soviet Union was, right? So the economy didn't quite benefit. So it's really the use and the commercialization, the deployment of the technology, rather than technology itself that has created economic growth. So I admire the Chinese successes, but I don't view it as an economic magic bullet. It is a force for Chinese economic growth, but then there are other areas that are bigger in terms of affecting the growth. I will view employment as very, very important, both high-tech entrepreneurship, but also low-tech entrepreneurship. I view manufacturing as quite important, service sector as quite important. A healthy economy should have all these forces contributing to the economic growth, rather than just promoting one pillar. There should be multiple pillars in an economy as large as China, in a country as large as China, and in a population as diverse as China. It's very important for people to keep in mind, even though Chinese colleges graduate many, many people, the college graduates as a total share of the population are still very, very small. right? So, I mean, how do you promote economic growth from people who don't really have technology and science in their education?
So there's room actually for the education sector to grow as well.
Oh, definitely, right? There are like multiple.
Because we hear a lot about, there's too many graduates who can't get jobs already.
But that's related to a different problem, right? Which is that the scientific sector, technological sector is not creating enough demand for those educated people. There are other sectors that are creating the demand, and we need to grow those other sectors as well. So I'm not against technology. I'm a professor at MIT. All I'm saying is that in a healthy economy, there ought to be multiple pillars of economic growth, and the government policy should be supporting all of them.
And do you think there's any chance that the kind of pressure from the Trump administration and the impact on exports could lead to some sort of a rebalancing within China's domestic economy over the next few years?
I think it provides an opportunity, just like 2008 financial crisis. But we know for sure 2008 financial crisis didn't change the government policy. In that type of system, economic necessities don't really dictate the eventual policy choices. It's really the politics that matters. So I think if we do see some signs, we ought to see more active discussions, which require more liberal movement, because that's not a view that is widely shared among the government officials.
So you need a more liberal sort of social atmosphere.
You need more voices. It's important. In the 1980s, you see a lot of the liberal voices within the political system, and we just don't see that today. It may still happen, I don't know, but we just don't see any sign of it.
Professor Yasheng Huang, thank you so much for joining us on China in Context.
Okay, thank you. It's good talking to you, Duncan. Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for on this episode. You can find information about SOAS China Institute events and read our latest blog articles on our website, soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.